Hi, I'm Mandy Medley, and I'm one of the worker owners at Pilsen Community Books, a worker cooperative and radical bookstore here in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And I am so excited and honored to welcome Madeline ffitch and Andreas Malm virtually here this afternoon for a discussion around some of the themes in their books, Stay and Fight and How to Blow Up a Pipeline, respectively. If you follow the store on social media, you know that the workers of PCB have been actively engaged in the indigenous-led fight against the Line 3 tar sands pipeline this summer, and both of these books have inspired much discussion among our comrades, both up north on the front lines and with our customers here in the shop. And for me personally, these books were both a great comfort and also provided motivation to continue the fight after the inevitable depression that followed returning to the real world after a summer spent with the water protectors. We chose these books alongside Winona LaDuke's To Be a Water Protector as our September picks for our subscription program. And we at the store were thinking about the climate crisis unfolding around us and what it means for each of us to stand in meaningful resistance. Can we simply vote our way to a better world? Can we do more to protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the places we call home? And we thank you in attendance today for thinking through these questions with us, and for Andreas and Madeline for joining us in conversation. And speaking of folks on the front line, I highly encourage you, if you are able, to donate to the Line 3 Legal Defense Fund, which provides support to people facing arrest, jail time, and state repression because of their opposition to Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline project. The Guardian recently reported that Enbridge has reimbursed U.S. police $2.4 million for arresting and surveilling hundreds of water protectors who oppose construction of its Line 3 pipeline. That's $2.4 million. And now many of those water protectors must navigate a confusing and costly legal system that is stacked against them. So I encourage you to support folks on the front line and donate to the Legal Defense Fund. And I'll put that link in the chat as soon as I'm finished with this introduction. A few quick notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce Madeline and Andreas, and I'll read a short bit from Andreas's book, and then we'll have a discussion, and then there will be time for a short Q&A. So if you have any questions at all, anytime during the event, feel free to just drop them in the chat, and I'll make sure that they are addressed at the appropriate time. If for some reason the stream ends because internet is terrible here in Chicago and it's raining, just hold tight, go back to our YouTube channel, we'll resume as soon as possible. And of course, I encourage you to purchase both of these books at our bookstore or borrow them from the library, borrow them from a friend up at camp, however you can get them, read them, they're amazing. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce Madeline and Andreas. Madeline ffitch writes and organizes in Appalachian, Ohio. She is the author of the novel Stay and Fight, which was called Electrifying by Oprah magazine, which I need to ask you about, Madeline, because I was so surprised by that. That's amazing. And was also one of the New York Times 9 books to watch out for in July. She is the author of the short story collection Valparaiso, Round the Horn, and her writing has appeared in Tin House, Electric Literature, Granta, Guernica, and Vice. And Andreas Malm is Associate Senior Lecturer in Human Ecology at Lund University. He is the author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, White Skin, Black Fuel, Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power, and The Roots of Global Warming and Corona Climate Chronic Emergency, War, Communism in the 21st Century. Okay, and I wanted to start out just by reading this tiny passage from How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which I think will frame some of our discussion here tonight. If you'll permit me. Normally we have authors read, but the interlocutor is going to read today. To say that the signals have fallen on the deaf ears of the ruling classes of this world would be an understatement. If these classes ever had any senses, they have lost them all. They are not perturbed by the smell from the blazing trees. They do not worry at the sight of islands sinking. They do not run from the roar of the approaching hurricanes. Their fingers never need to touch the stalks from withered harvests. Their mouths do not become sticky and dry after a day with nothing to drink. To appeal to their reason and to common sense would evidently be futile. The commitment to an endless accumulation of capital wins out every single time. After the past 3 decades, there can be no doubt that the ruling classes are constitutionally incapable of responding to the catastrophe in any other way than by expediting it. Of their own accord, and under their inner compulsion, they can do nothing but burn their way to the end. And so we are still here. We erect our camps of sustainable solutions. We cook our vegan food and hold our assemblies. We march, we block, we stage theaters. We hand over lists of demands to ministers. We chain ourselves, we march the next day too. We are still perfectly, immaculately peaceful. There are more of us now, by orders of magnitude. There is another pitch of desperation in our voices. We talk of extinction and of no future. And still business continues very much as usual. At what point do we escalate? When do we conclude that the time has come to also try something different? When do we start physically attacking the things that consume our planet and destroy them with our own hands? Is there a good reason we have waited this long? And again, that's from the first few pages of How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Andreas, if you don't mind, I wanted to start with a question for you. Early on in your book, you write about Lanchester's paradox, based on the magnitude of what is at stake, literally close to all life on Earth. Why the general lack of action in response to climate breakdown? There is a relation between activist inaction and the hollow words of the politicians. Can you talk a bit about the premise, the basic argument of your book, and how you came to write it?
Well, how I came to write it was, it was in the summer of 2018, which was pretty bad in Northern Europe. We had in Sweden, the country where I live, unprecedented heat and wildfires and droughts. And during that summer, I was sort of freaking out about the absence of a climate movement on any scale that corresponded to the magnitude of the threat. So I felt that I had to write something about the need to massively step up action. Now, fortunately, I was far from the only one who felt that way in that particular summer. It was at the end of that summer that Greta Thunberg sat down in front of the parliamentary building in Stockholm and started her school strike movement. So when I actually sat down to write this book in late 2019, the situation was very different. We here in Europe felt that we were at the crest of an unprecedented wave of climate mobilization with people on the streets in greater numbers than we'd ever seen before. And I, as many others who'd been in the climate movement for some time, were quite excited about this, naturally. But also I felt a tiny bit of frustration with the fact that we were still doing the same thing as we've been doing for some time, although with, again, totally different numbers. Marching, petitioning, appealing, protesting, gently, peacefully, with very little of the kind of rage that you could see in 2019 in lots of other social movements around the world. I mean, the period just up until the outbreak of the pandemic was one of quite a lot of social turmoil around the world, from Chile to Lebanon and Hong Kong and loads of places. And in those you would invariably see an element of confrontation with the ruling order, with police forces, and property destruction in one kind or another. But that sort of edge was, and still largely is, with exceptions, missing from the climate movement in the global north. And I'm talking about the global north. So that was the immediate background to how this book came about. And then obviously the climate movement here in the north fell off a cliff after the outbreak of the pandemic, and it's now trying to regain some of the momentum that was lost, but it's been very much absent throughout the pandemic. But I should stress that I say this from a European perspective. I cannot sort of claim any universality beyond the context where I find myself.
Yeah, something that you talk about a lot in your book about what we do when nonviolent mass action fails. And I think we're seeing some of the same questions asked in other movements now. Like in the US against COVID-19, we've just accepted the higher death tolls, and in the U.S. also, where many abortion rights activists have just resigned themselves to a post-Roe world. Like, they can't do anything about it to change it, so what are we going to do now? But in your book, you outline how so many of the movements that pacifist climate leaders claim were nonviolent were actually anything but. One line I really liked was the psychology of strategic pacifism is an exercise in active repression. If you don't mind, would you mind going through just like one or two of the examples of how these movements, like the suffragette movement or the civil rights movement or the abolition of slavery, weren't really as nonviolent as so many people like to claim?
Yeah. I mean, I could go into the details of these various historical episodes that the strategic pacifists advance in support of their idea or their conclusion, but one thing that I have sort of tried to emphasize in talks about the book after it came out is a much more recent episode that seems to me to sort of disprove the idea of strategic pacifism. So the idea being that as soon as you overstep the boundary of absolute nonviolence, you alienate the masses and you lose numbers and popular support and you dwindle into insignificance. This is the general idea. Now, this doesn't seem to apply to the uprising after the murder of George Floyd, which was the largest social movement in US history, if you count by the numbers of people on the streets. And as far as I can tell, it was set off by 3 days of rioting in Minneapolis that culminated with the conquest and destruction of the police station in the 3rd precinct, where Derek Chauvin and his colleagues had been based. And that action it received the support of something like 53% in a poll of Americans in general. And it seems to me to have worked as a catalyst for people to take to the streets in unprecedented numbers, just the opposite of what strategic pacifism would predict. Because that sort of action that happened in Minneapolis was way beyond the boundary of nonviolent civil disobedience as conceived by the strategic pacifists. But it didn't frighten people, it didn't scare them off the streets. To the contrary, it rallied them to the streets as never before because, and I'm drawing here on Wiki Osterweil, I think her name is, who wrote the book In Defense of Looting, and she argued in a piece in the Nation that what happened in Minneapolis took the police back into the realm of history. It showed that structural and systemic police violence against African Americans is not a biological, natural fate that we have to resign to. It's something that we can actually physically disrupt. And it therefore seems to have worked as an inspiration for a movement that was, of course, overwhelmingly peaceful, as in the bulk of the activities that happened in that uprising were completely peaceful, which again is gainsaying the idea of strategic pacifism, that as soon as you develop a more militant edge, you cannot also continue with peaceful mass action. Now, I think the climate movement needs similar things. It needs, because one of the greatest problems, perhaps the greatest problem in the climate struggle, is the general perception that fossil fuel infrastructure is some kind of natural fate that we can't disrupt. It's just something that we take for granted as normal. It's normality itself, something that we just have to resign to. That's an illusion, but it needs to be punctured with actions similar to what played out, I think, in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. With all, mutatis mutandis, as the Latin singles, with all due differences, of course. I'm not saying that these are identical struggles or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, this is, you don't need to go far back in history to show that strategic pacifism is flawed. What happened last year in the US, to me, indicates that it is.
Yeah, you beat me to my second question. I wanted to talk more about what of course, the uprising and the attempted burning of the police station in 2020, which is, of course, a spontaneous action, but the potential for collaboration across movements. And also, Madeline, I know that you are you're very experienced activist in the climate movement. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the collaboration you've seen between indigenous organizers who have, of course, been leading the fight, not only here in the U.S., but across the world, and white climate justice activists. And have you seen the nature of the fight change over the years that you've been involved in that way? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't, obviously it's two non-indigenous people talking about climate justice, which is sort of ironic because that movement is being led by indigenous in here in North America and Turtle Island. I mean, the roadmap is from frontline communities standing up for themselves, and indigenous people are showing everybody else the way, like how we are fighting, how to fight. And I think one of the important things to know about that, to notice about it, is that like anything else, there's a diversity of tactics. So one thing I've been dismayed to see, I come from, I guess I would say, like, my parents are old leftists, and I am definitely an inheritor of like the progressive left. And I am not an adherent, I'm not a pacifist, and I am not neither strategic nor ideological, although strategic pacifism obviously has its place. I'm in favor of a diversity of tactics. And I would say that I've been dismayed to see the way that sort of white progressives and white ideological pacifists have kind of done. I mean, settlers are always co-opting anything native that they can, but definitely co-opting native ways of resisting and saying, like, we need to follow, for example, the issue of prayer. Like, we need to follow prayer, and in sort of like mainstream white pacifist conception of that means that's code for inaction or non-confrontational action or highly symbolic action. And I just have been doing enough work right now with enough different communities to know that that's highly situational. There's a lot of different attitudes about that. And I've been lucky enough to work with, militant Native organizers who talk about prayer and action going hand in hand. And those are who I would consider to be my mentors I don't even know. I never say I'm part of a climate movement. I just sort of feel like I'm doing what I can where I can. But I'm aware of the climate movement and the examples that Andreas talks about. So I think, something I'm interested in is supporting a diversity of tactics and finding affinity with the people that we have affinity with and fighting, using the leverage we have and fighting in the way that we can. And one thing I hope that Andreas's book, I mentioned this before we went on, has a positive effect. It seems like for some reason the sort of like mass movement part of the climate movement is listening to what he's saying in a different way, or is ready to hear it or something. One thing we see on the ground is that anything confrontational that happens, there's somebody there to say that it's violence. And I mean, I take your point, Andreas, that we should just own up to that property destruction is violence. It's just, what kind of violence is it? But I kind of feel like, I mean, for me, I'm like, I don't even necessarily think that's violence. And I also think everybody has it gets a little nonsensical if we say we're totally against all of that. We're completely against all of that. And I think you kind of prove in your book, and you've shown a lot of different ways, that nobody's actually against any type of anger or confrontation. Also, the idea that anger is alienating is highly situational. I actually really appreciated your example about the XR people saying, like, we're engineers, we're doctors, we're everyone. And I live in Appalachia. I live in the lowest income county in the state of Ohio, and I fight alongside Appalachian people. And people here understand anger. These are the inheritors of the Battle of Blair Mountain, and people understand. People have been fighting. My neighbors are all coal miners, and they're like, oh, you kids, you're not gonna, I mean, I'm not a kid, but they're like, you're not going to win, but you can try to fight them. We've been trying to fight them. So it's like there's no love lost. They understand how bad extractive industry is, and people understand anger because anger makes sense, because people are angry about what's happening to them and happening to their communities. And the idea that we have to change every type of demonstration or protest into some kind of like feel-good festival, I don't know. I guess we can do that sometimes, but that's also alienating to a whole other group of people.
Yes.
So I think that, I think that people do a lot of sort of second guessing of who they believe their audience to be when they're fighting on the ground. And that's something that I don't like. I do not like to see. And I'm hoping that the impact of a book like Andreas's would mean that those of us who are on the ground trying to support a diversity of tactics are not peace policed by people in the movement who are kind of self-appointed experts, and I think actually come to movement work with a lack of humility and a sort of ahistorical perspective. I mean, the cultural amnesia is pretty quick, right? I mean, we were all out in the streets because those brave youth burnt down that cop shop and it was electrifying. That's why we were in the street. I mean, we've seen like this pussy hat march, and these millions of people are out. It doesn't change anything and no one hears it, and people are doing it to feel good. They pat themselves on the back and then they go home. The reason that was different last summer is because people were pushing it harder and because that cop shop burnt down, and everybody immediately in their hearts felt great about it. Even if afterwards they're like, oh, maybe that wasn't, oh no, the immediate response was like, this makes sense. This evidently makes sense. It's in context. I think that is really important. And that's why we were even out there. And yet, within the week, the same type of people, like liberals and progressives, were saying we're kneeling with police, and we're saying that outside agitators were the ones who were pushing property destruction, and we're trying to do these really horrible things in the streets, like point out people who were throwing bricks or whatever to the police, cooperating with the police in that type of way. People who on their Facebook event would have the picture of the cop shop burning down would then at the event be policing and turning people into the police who they thought were being too confrontational. So, I think that that's something that the movement, if the one thing that people can take away from this is supporting a diversity of tactics, I think we would all gain from that.
Hell yes. Folks at home probably couldn't see me snapping in agreement, but thank you, Madeline. That was amazing.
Yes.
Andreas, do you have anything you want to add before?
No. That was amazing.
Yeah. I feel like you just won so many of the arguments I've had with so many people in my head, Madeline. So thank you. That was great. Switching gears a little bit, what was refreshing to me about both of your books, and this is probably obvious to both of you, but that you tackle and name capitalism as the cause, not only of climate change, but of a lot of human suffering today. Obviously, Madeline, you do this more obliquely in your novel, but it's still there. Can you talk a bit about how the politics in your books affected their reception and some of the debates they may have inspired, and why so few environmental and climate-related groups are unwilling to talk about capitalism as the actual problem? They seem to skirt around it.
Madeline.
I think that some of these big green groups in their mind, they're trying to cast a wide net. I think it's a little bit of a twisted version of something I think is really important and true, which is that we're all impacted, no matter what our ideological standpoint is. We're all impacted by climate catastrophe. I think it's really powerful to move away from ideology and move into a space of non-rigid and non-doctrinaire imagination. I've seen people on the front lines heal from ideological organizing work by just having to do real work, like haul water and chop wood and have people's backs in the streets against the police and have people's backs against the industry. And that kind of washes out all of this, like, which org are you a part of, kind of washes that away. And I think that's important. On the other hand, I think a group like, Extinction Rebellion has been in big trouble because they are unwilling to make the connection to a larger political vision, especially when it comes to whiteness. And as a result, a leading white supremacist told his followers that they should go join the climate movement. They should join XR. So if you're a white person, yeah, this is a thing that happened this year. So this is something that all of us who are white people and settler people are should be grappling with. If you're not being explicitly anti-fascist in your work, then fascists are right there to co-opt what you're doing. I live in Appalachia, which in the past 5 years, the white supremacists have declared it a white ethno-state, and they'll come down here talking about pure air and water, and they'll use the exact same rhetoric. They'll use socialist rhetoric, and they'll use anti-capitalist rhetoric, and they'll use pro-environment rhetoric, and it's Nazi rhetoric. They just are like, yeah, and also we're Nazis, and so that's one way that they try to recruit in this area. So it's really important, and they use a similar aesthetic, like similar, you talk a lot about climate camps, and maybe they're different in Europe, but this kind of like homemade flyer type thing, you know? So we know in Appalachia that when we're organizing, we need to be very specifically anti-fascist when we're organizing. And I think that making those connections are important. And I also think one thing we've had to learn down here, because a lot of people in Appalachia are, will operate from a kind of, you know, getting people off their property with a shotgun, which is great. The pipeliners come around, they chase them off their property with a shotgun, but they've had to make the leap to understanding that they're on stolen land and that they need to be following the lead of indigenous organizers who are really leading this movement across the continent. I think Standing Rock was a flashpoint for that, because it was a learning experience for so many non-native people who are also fighting extractive industry, and to figure out what real solidarity looks like. So I think that's important, but I also feel like if we get too ideological, it's to our detriment. I don't pretend to be beyond politics, but at this point, I try to put everything through the lens of, is this good? How is this going to materially impact land-based people? And I know that if we just switched out socialism for capitalism, that we would have a socialist pipeline, and I don't want one of those. So, I mean, it's true. These big centralized power structures are really good. They love infrastructure, and they love centralized power, and I think that is not going to work against climate catastrophe, and I think it's unjust. So, you know, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the big greens are real mealy-mouthed and trying to, you know, compromise and not alienate anyone and pander to the right. And that's certainly not going to work either. I mean, that's a horrible idea.
I couldn't agree more. I don't have much to add. I mean, I could give a European gloss on this whole argument, but as a position, I am entirely on board, of course, with everything that Madeline just said. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how big of a force XR is in the US. My impression is that it's bigger in Europe, and particularly in the UK. And I don't know if you've seen what's been playing out in the streets of the UK over the past couple of weeks with Insulate Britain, this offshoot from XR, which I have to say I find somewhat problematic. Mm-hmm. But yeah, XR really has. I mean, it's become a sort of cliche on the radical left to trash talk XR, and I can sometimes be a little bit annoyed with that, because many leftists who complain about XR do it from a kind of distance of virtue. Yeah, when XR people in our countries in Europe have actually been fighting quite a lot and paying a price in terms of repression. But XR has some serious ideological flaws, and that's why sort of the edge of my book is targeted against it's against them, not so much for what they've been doing, partly that, but more for what they've said that you must not absolutely do. So XR, when it started, really said that this is the only thing that the climate movement can be allowed to do. And that's problematic. And the whole idea of beyond politics that you referred to, Madeline, is, I think, deeply, well, it's delusional. And also, as you said, as a way to supposedly, avoid any kind of antagonizing or alienating, just embracing everyone, it ends up doing exactly the opposite, because there is no way that you can get people on board when you refuse to take into account questions of race or class, for that matter. Here in my city, in Malmö, which is one of the most multicultural cities in Sweden, famous for that. When the XR crowd goes down once a week to block a road here, they're immaculately white, and the contrast between that and the general population here is very stark, and it just speaks to an ongoing failure of this movement, which unfortunately applies to other branches of the movement as well in Europe, to go beyond a certain white middle class ghetto where you can imagine that you're beyond politics, but that just keeps you more, not less, isolated from other groups in society that would need to be involved. Yeah. Sorry for rambling here, but yeah.
No, that's great. I mean, along those lines, I had a question for Madeline. Obviously, the fight against Line 3, as well as most of the fights against oil pipelines here in the U.S., is Indigenous-led and led by queer activists who continue in the struggle before and after the new spotlight has moved on. And most of the characters in Stay and Fight, one of the reasons I love it, are queer and or Indigenous. And I wonder if you'd be up for talking a bit about how the climate justice fight in the U.S. is portrayed in the media, who gets camera time, who is quoted in media, and how you came to write those beautiful and complicated characters in Stay and Fight. And did you draw from your own activist experience when you wrote them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, that it's like one of my favorite writers, Grace Paley, would say, you write from what you know into what you don't know. And so it's interesting. The reception of the novel is like, it's busting so many stereotypes. But for me, I mean, living and working in Appalachia and, being part of the family that I'm a part of, these are the people that I know. This is, to me, the reality of what it's like to be doing justice work and also to be trying to make a life in Appalachia and kind of build from the ground up here. So I would be straining if I wrote not about the people that I know and see every day, if that makes any sense. I guess it's not maybe a very specific answer to your question, but yeah, and I think one of the joys for me of writing is that when I write myself into a corner, I can call up a friend or a family member or compatriot of some kind and interview them about their best at. And so that led me into some pretty interesting directions. So yeah, like at some point I called up a friend of mine. One of the characters was led out of economic desperation to work on a pipeline. So I called up actually an in-law of mine who's a cousin to find out if what it's like to work on a pipeline, because she's a pipeliner. She's also a Native woman. So the way she was starting talking to me about working on a pipeline and also the experience of violence of being in her position and being a pipeline worker, it wasn't something I couldn't just be like, okay, thanks for telling me how an excavator works. Bye. It sent the novel in a different direction. And then I showed her drafts of the part that I thought she might recognize herself in and got more feedback. And so it's a way to kind of, I think one of the joys for me of writing the novel has been kind of keeping these reciprocal relationships going with people in my life who have these kind of interesting levels of expertise. And, it's also really opened my eyes. It's very, when these extractive industry, these big companies talk about building jobs and being employers, I just think about all the people that I know here, when they have permitted a pipeline 200 feet from our house, we went up and down the line, talked to everybody up and down the line, and people would say, yeah, I'll tell you how you think how bad that pipeline is. I know how bad pipelines are because I had to go up north and work on a pipeline and I lost a finger. And you know what I mean? People know because they're working for the industry, and they're not necessarily working for the industry because they want to or they think it's a great idea. And sometimes they swear off of it. They learn the hard way. And sometimes out of economic desperation, that's what they're doing. But even among people who are working for that industry, there's a wide variety of relationships to that industry. And then in the end, this woman that I interviewed for the book, I put her in touch with a journalist so she could tell the story of how predatory and violent the industry had been to her and other Native people that they love to say that they're employing and put in all their advertising material.
I have one more literary world question, if you will entertain me, Madeline.
Yeah.
since Trump has been elected, books about social justice, and I put those in scare quotes, have found their market and are no longer like sidelined or seen as niche interest. And climate fiction is a widely popular genre. But I am often frustrated because I see all these books about climate change and climate disaster, but very rarely do I see these same kind of literary communities move to action. How do you think writers can meaningfully contribute to the fight against climate change off the page? And I mean mostly like fiction writers, climate fiction writers, that kind of thing.
It's interesting. I think artists often, and I am an artist, so I can say this, are they take a defensive stance. Like they say, like, my art is my activism. And I mean, maybe it is. Everyone wants to say that whatever they're doing is their activism. And I just kind of feel like I've been, I used to tour with a theater company, and we'd go around and we'd perform for like frontline activist communities or whatever. And I just thought what they were doing, that putting their bodies on the line, was very exciting. And it was clearly very different than what I was doing, which was making theater. And I don't really feel like you need to be comparing those two things. So I'm a novelist, and I also go lock down a machinery sometimes and try to support movement work when I can, when and where I can. There's not really any substitute for that. I think it's really important to have a myriad of ways that people get involved, which is why when I say I support a diversity of tactics, I do support people who are doing big peaceful marches and talking, taking the legislative angle if that's what they want to spend their time doing. That's not what I want to spend my time doing. But I do think, that makes it, I want there to be a movement that all the generations can be a part of, and people of all abilities can be a part of. And I want there to be a place for everyone. But I think a lot of times people don't want to move outside of their comfort zone, and they'll find any kind of intellectual, and writers and artists who are usually pretty smart people are great at finding a lot of self-justifying reasons why what they're like, well, my contribution is to write a poem. My contribution is to write a novel. And that's fine. But I don't know, why do we have to compare those two things? They're really different. It's really different to be part of a direct action community and being by yourself writing a novel. And I don't think we have to make them seem like they're the same,
Yes, I do. In a 2017 essay for Granta, you wrote, Madeline, the idea, and this essay I love, I cry every time I read it. You wrote the idea, that I lost the quote. The idea that political work is for young, idealistic, childless adults is one way to keep such work carefully controlled, to cast it as exceptional, a hobby for the privileged few, when of course it's neither. It's ordinary and necessary, and so is parenting. I know you are both parents. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how being a parent affects your activism and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I just talked a lot. Andreas, do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, practically speaking, I have to say that having kids is not beneficial to one's activism, because for me, it's a constraint in terms of, the ability to join climate camps and other kinds of actions. I mean, I've been doing it while being a father as well, and I've brought my kids to some of these sites of protest, but obviously there is a certain kind of freedom that you have when you don't have kids, I would say. Having kids as sort of a existential condition in the climate crisis is of course a fraught thing, and I often get this question, or people want to discuss how do you deal with this, having kids and knowing about what's going on. I personally tend to sort of compartmentalize my parenting a little bit. It's not really feasible to go on feeding one's kids with knowledge about global heating. I'm not keeping it secret from them. My 7-year-old is pretty aware of what's going on and what I'm working on, and she has an idea of climate action and protests and things like that. But it's not something that you can keep talking on all the time. You have to sort of restrain yourself a little bit when you're with kids, and take that as an opportunity to have some mental rest from all the bad news that you otherwise have to deal with. I mean, that's my approach to it. I'm not saying that it's the right one. Yeah. On another note, I don't know if you in the US have had this weird debate that we've had in the European climate movement, or on the fringe of it, about not having kids as a kind of duty in the climate crisis. Okay, yeah, you're familiar with that. I think it's very absurd. Yeah.
As someone who also wants kids, I find it absurd, but yes.
Yeah. Good. Go have kids. So.
Yeah. Madeline?
Yeah, I mean, I have found it to be just an important part of life to take my kids with me to the front lines whenever I can, and also to respect them and what they need and what they want. But I think I mean, what you quoted from that essay and what that essay is actually about, learning from indigenous movements that have really strong intergenerational emphasis. And I think that it's sort of, essentially a white supremacist death cult to be like, nobody should have kids and you're a breeder and you're wrong if you do that. I don't think that actually is putting people in touch with what it means to belong to the land and be part of the earth and part of natural cycles. Not to sound like a hippie. I do think there's an issue. Obviously, there's an issue with like class and consumption and middle class and upper class white people whose kids take up all the resources of way more resources than they should. That's a big conversation that we definitely all need to be having. But just the idea of being, if we don't have a movement that involves elders and children, it's not a movement, it's a social scene. So I'm too old to be trying to hang out on a social scene all the time anymore. I don't do that anymore. And then as for talking to my kids, I actually do feel like at this point, I don't sit them down and tell them like every bit of the science. I don't even actually tell myself every bit of the science. I already know that I need to be fighting. I already know I'm against it. But I think with my kids, we're resisting, we're fighting back, and we need to do that, and we need to not be fatalistic or defeatist about it. And also at the same time, I think that we need to take a tip from generations of people who've fought in horrible and genocidal circumstances, who are just fighting no matter what, because that's how you hold your head up, and that's how you recognize yourself. That's how you recognize your community. That's how you can hold your head up around your children, and to show our children, this is a life, this is how it's going to be. You're going to be living in a community of resistance. You're going to be learning how to take care of each other. You're going to be taking care of your younger brother. You're going to be around people who you're taking care of and who are taking care of you. And if we are going to be living through what is to come, we are going to be learning from the ground up how to care for each other and how to live in resistance and still find meaning and joy in that. And so to me, that's really important. My kids are 5 and 8. They just turned, it's like birthdays just happened, so I can't remember. But and so they're starting them out young with like, there's not really good news. I mean, the good news is that we love each other. We're, as to quote Zapatistas, we're walking in step with other dignified feet. And this is, this is as good a life as anyone could ask for, really, is to be in a culture of resistance. It's a life's work,
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I have one more, I have a lot more questions, but I'll ask just one more because we have some in the chat. And if you have any other questions that you want to drop in the chat, now would be the time because we're approaching an hour here. There's one I wanted to ask that my friends and I have been thinking a lot about as we are coming out of the summer of direct action. The case for more and more effective direct action is compelling, obviously. All of us here think that. And I wonder how we can support people engaged in direct action, not only during the action, but afterwards. Jail support, legal funds, what other communities of care need to be created to support those on the front lines doing this work and to make it more possible to actually do the kind of direct action that needs to be done.
Madeline.
I think it's interesting right now, talking about care. It used to be self-care, now it's community care. Care, it's really important, and I'm feminist and I'm here for it. I wouldn't be part of this movement if we weren't coming from a perspective of care. And I also think it's also one of those things that we need to remember, that care and action are not at odds they're not at odds. They go hand in hand. So for some people, action is care, and it doesn't mean that we don't need care afterwards. But sometimes I think that the whole concept of care lately is wielded as something that's in opposition to action, and I just don't want to see something as important as care being used in that way. I have some wonderful friends who are doing like somatic kind of aftercare for people who've been on the front lines, especially people who were brutalized fighting Line 3 this summer with the police violence. So I think that that's really helpful. And then I just think that the ongoing legal support is really what sets real grassroots direct action communities apart from a lot of these big nonprofits. You get people coming to our resistance movements who are in nonprofit recovery, and it's because like these big groups will just throw them out, get arrested, sacrifice yourself to the state. Good luck with that. And one of the big differences is that if you work in around organizers that I admire and that I like to work with, the legal defense and the legal follow-up is as important. People are with you through every step of the process, and we understand it to be a collective undertaking.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree more. Again.
Great.
I'm interested to know if the vibe is different in Europe. Like in your book, you talk about vegan soup a lot. I'm like, I've never had vegan soup. I'm always eating like buffalo meat, mac and cheese.
Welcome to the German climate camps. I mean, on the question of repression and legal aid and these things, I would suspect that things aren't really as brutal here as they are where you are yet. Because for climate camps in Germany, for instance, there isn't that link to indigenous struggles. I mean, there are no indigenous populations in Germany that are on the front line of the coal mines or whatever. So there isn't that racial, there isn't that settler colonial history, and with all the violence that comes with it. That said, though, there is, of course, a tendency for police repression to become militarized and for climate direct action to become criminalized. We're seeing this with Extinction Rebellion even in the UK, and now with Insular Britain. Even though they stay perfectly peaceful. My experience from climate camps in Germany is that there is a very good structure in place for dealing with repression, with people who end up being arrested. I mean, as I make clear in my book, of the various branches of the climate movement that we have in Europe, the one that I massively prefer is Ende Gelände, the German climate camp movement, for a number of reasons. One being that Ende Gelände has never considered it a goal or a virtue to get arrested. I mean, the task has always, the goal has always been to break through the police cordons and avoid being arrested to the greatest extent possible. Whereas there is this sort of ethos in XR and other branches of the movement that it's a good thing to get arrested, because then you really sort of prove that you are worthy of the cause or something like that. And the idea is also that if you just fill up the prisons with people, you will make change. That's a terrible idea for many reasons, and it's been one of the greatest drawbacks of the whole XR phenomenon, that it has had this idea of we want to end up in the arms of the police, which has made it impossible for racialized communities to engage with XR. Yeah. I totally agree that the attitude towards the repressive state apparatus has to be obviously an antagonistic one, a critical one, not sending flowers to the police and stuff like that as XR did back in 2019. By the way, I do think that what happened in the US last year with the Floyd uprising has sort of forced XR to revise its attitude to the police, although I'm not sure about it. But yeah, we need to be critical of the repressive state apparatus, and when comrades do, unfortunately, as they do, end up in the arms of the police, there need to be structures for helping them at the best of our ability. And I've seen quite a few good examples of how that can work. Although, again, obviously, the conditions on the ground are very different from in the US. But then again, I mean, you can compare to the occupied territories in Palestine or other places where people suffer even worse forms of repression than what I think you do in the US. So all of these things are relative, yeah.
Well, on those lines, I want to say that I dropped the link for Line 3 Legal Fund in the chat. Donate there, check out the work they do. It's really great. Comrades, including myself, depend on them, so go for it. We have one question here in the chat that I want to ask, and then I have one more before I let you both go. Someone, Andreas, in the chat wants to know if you've read Windhagen's recent, I probably butchered that pronunciation, I'm so sorry, Windhagen's recent-ish work on the nonviolent action, which differs from the classic strategic pacifism take. And if so, what is your response to it?
Well, the answer is that I haven't, but I have to, because I'm going to meet him and sit and talk to him in a sort of filmed debate in a week. So I have to read up on his work, but I haven't.
All right. Well, then I have two questions, one from the chat and one for me. What's the next battleground do y'all see as the next battleground in the fight, either where you are or internationally, in the fight against climate destruction? As here, Line 3 construction has wrapped up, and Andreas says yet another summit of talking heads prepares to convene in Glasgow. What do y'all see as like the next real battleground?
Yeah, I mean, COP26 is the next big thing happening where I am. Obviously, I don't expect much to come out of it. I do entertain some hopes that it can serve as an occasion to revitalize the climate movement here, and that there can be protests around the summit. I'm not on the ground in Scotland yet, so I don't have a sense of the mobilization, if there is a momentum or not. I do know of a campaign that I think is spot on, and that's Collapse Total, that will begin after COP26, targeting Total, the single largest private company based in France, which is rising to the peaks of climate criminality. They are, as you might know, currently about to begin construction on the East African crude oil pipeline, which will be the world's longest heated oil pipeline, and wreak tremendous havoc on ecosystems and people's lives in Uganda and Tanzania. And Total recently signed a deal with Iraq to build massive new oil and gas installations in that country. They also want to go into the Arctic to drill for even more fossil gas, and they have the backing of Macron to do all of this. And I would assume that if he's beaten by one of the two wonderful far-right rivals that he will have in the next year's presidential election, Total will get as much support from any of those. So there is, and here really is that Lanchester paradox that was referred to. I mean, France is a country that isn't, it's not foreign to militant mass protests, but there is no movement in France against Total that I am aware of. And really, France and Germany, being the two major countries in the European Union, are very sharply contrasting cases where the climate movement in Germany is a mass phenomenon. And it has sort of radical flanks in France, where you see far more social unrest and class struggle playing out of the last half decade or so. There is no climate movement on any similar scale. But Collapse Total will be an attempt for the climate movement, by the climate movement in Europe to, I mean, obviously the aim is to bring down Total. I mean, I would be in favor of socializing that company and transforming it into something completely different. But in the short term, there needs to be an aggressive, radical campaign against that company for building this pipeline in East Africa. I mean, it's just insane that they're doing it.
Madeline, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, the Mountain Valley Pipeline is still being built through Virginia and West Virginia, through Appalachia. So there's been monumental efforts against that. There's been a tree sit that's been up for 2 years that just finally came down. And then ever since then, just endless amounts of blockades going up all the time. So I think there's a real chance to stop that one. I'm going to be helping out with that. Definitely. That's my region. It's important to be present for that. And then Paiute and Shoshone people are fighting a lithium mine in Thacker Pass on their territory. That's, I think, an important thing. They're calling for people to come be on the front lines there, and their camp is directly blocking that mine from happening. And then, of course, I'm sure people this week are watching Wet'suwet'en people fighting Coastal GasLink, and that's been like a huge flashpoint for me. Before I even had kids, I mean, years and years ago, getting to talk with some of those organizers and hear what they've been doing to defend their territory against that company and the encroachment of the police has just been really, really inspiring. And I feel like anytime I get discouraged, I just like look at one of their videos with that militant action. And I was watching one of those today and actually showed my kid one of those where people from so many different tribal nations came up to show solidarity and were being so confrontational to the RCMP, but in a way that makes so much sense, you know, leave, get off, you're invading, get away from here, you know, that makes sense. That it makes sense to be like that. It makes sense to have that level of anger, and it makes sense to show people that you love and care about or consider relatives that you're willing to stand up for them in that way. And that we'll stand up for ourselves. So I think that those campaigns are things that I want to make sure that I have energy to support. And actually, it makes me kind of think about, I guess before I had a couple questions. One of the things I thought was interesting, Andreas, was in your book, and this might actually be because of its focus on Europe, and I'm, working in North America. But there's kind of a conflation of like, or maybe it feels to me like sometimes you characterize anything that isn't part of mass movement organizing as this like pernicious vanguardist type of organizing. Of course, I'm going to come out of the closet right now and say I'm an Earth Firster, and I have great distaste for Deep Green Resistance, not least of all because they're openly transphobic. And I consider them to be authoritarian and mostly exist on the internet. So they're high in rhetoric, low on action, high on authoritarian rhetoric, highly committed to a brand of feminism that I don't think is feminism at all. So I would not consider those. Whereas to me, Earth First at this point is a solidarity network, and it's one of the ways. I'm not here to support a brand. I'm against orgs. I'm into individual activists, and actually on that note, I'll say some XR people threw down really hard against Line 3 this summer, notwithstanding their, different ideological attitudes. People really showed up. And that didn't make me think, XR showed up. It made me think these organizers showed up. I really try to deal with people for who they are and trying to let them, leave the orgs and the acronyms behind a little bit. But I will say that here, Earth First is a tradition that acts as a solidarity network and kind of like it's a pretty small network of people, but that has a lot of generational knowledge of direct action tactics that is useful across movement organizing. And also it comes from a really specific rural organizing tradition where mass movement organizing isn't always possible, but people are protecting the places that they love and the places that they call home. So when we see rural blockades happening, that comes from a tradition that I don't think it's vanguardist. I don't think it matters that, it's not something that says like, we don't need anyone else. We just need like the elite few who are in the know. But it's saying, and this is the type of organizing that I am part of and that I actually like to talk about to people to help sort of demystify the whole idea of engaging in direct action, where you can just do it with the friends that you have and the resources that you have where you live, for the communities that you love. And you don't have to have thousands of people, and you don't have to have porta potties, and you don't have to, you can shut down something with just a few people and not very much equipment and not very much expertise. And the thing I would agree with that you said is that I don't think arrest is its own virtue. You know, we want to stop construction from happening. We want to stop the thing from happening. And arrest is sometimes a byproduct of that, maybe too often, maybe more often than we like. And I will own up to some actions being not very imaginative and formulaic sometimes. But we're playing the ball as she lies, right? I'm going to quote Zapatista again, say we're walking and asking questions. So to me, at least where I live, those kinds of organizing configurations are pretty key to and not in opposition to mass movement organizing, right? But if we have 10 people, we can shut down a construction site. And I think it's important for people to know that, because I think sometimes people are waiting for like the big moment before they feel like they can join in. But rural communities know that we just kind of play the ball as she lies. And I think it's one reason why rural organizers are finding a lot of solidarity with indigenous organizers who are often organizing in very rural and remote places too, and with small groups of people making really potent blockades.
Do we have time for, can I quickly comment on this? Yeah, so, finally we might be able to ferret out a little bit of a disagreement, or a hint of a disagreement here at least. So to explain my position here, I'm certainly not against vanguardist politics. I mean, to come out of the closet here, I come from a Leninist political tradition.
I'm against vanguardist politics.
Okay, I'm not, but I'm against substitutionist politics, as we call it in this tradition. So
okay.
The idea that these deep green resistance people have, we should give up on the idea of building a mass movement and just go for small combatant groups of combatants and things like that. Yeah, I might have been unfair to Earth First and the sort of eco-touch movement in the 1990s, but as I recall it from the 90s, these groups that certainly existed in Europe as well at that moment did not relate, and did not really try to relate to any kind of mass politics or mass action.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I think that if we are going to develop a radical flank of the climate movement today, it needs to exist and try to nurture a relation to a mass movement, because otherwise it's pretty pointless. And here, I mean, it's true that you can accomplish a lot with small numbers, and we should make the most of that. But then we also need to conceive of our actions in relation to the masses. And here, Insulate Britain, that we've just mentioned in passing, really serves as a bad case, I think, because what they're doing is they're taking their small numbers of people and they're blocking highways in the UK, and they're pissing a lot of people off because they sort of demonstrate a tone deafness or an insensitivity to how ordinary working people are going about their lives, their days, that they need to go to their jobs to be able to put food on the table for their kids, as many of the working class mothers have come up to the activists and told them in desperation. And there was also this scene with a medical emergency with a woman who was traveling to hospital who wasn't allowed through. And this is a kind of action that has a detrimental effect on the relation between the activists and the masses, because it just pisses people off. And I think that the potential for doing direct actions that target an enemy that really is an enemy and that people can identify as an enemy is lost in these kind of moments. I think it would. I mean, this action group could get as much attention if they, I don't know, went into the richest neighborhoods in London and set off stink bombs, or threw dung into the richest people's gardens or something like that. That would be a more precise kind of action, and it would not disrupt working people's lives in that fashion. So yes, I'm for small-scale action as well, but it needs to be designed and conceived in relation to mass politics, because the ultimate goal must always be to get as many people as possible involved. And clearly, that's not what's been going on in the UK over the past weeks. It has just widened the rift between working classes in the UK and the climate movement, and the XR sort of milieu is continuously in an almost compulsive fashion doing this, because these activists have no class consciousness.
I think that that's very true, but I mean, it's really important to acknowledge that, Earth First used to call themselves rednecks for wilderness, maybe redneck's a bad word these days, but a lot of these small scale action traditions here come from working class traditions. And one thing that has been really obnoxious to see, like in Minnesota, for example, is this attitude that, and I think it comes from Trumpian politics, that it's like the working class against like the coastal elites who are like fighting this pipeline. But actually it's people from the reservation right there and who are fighting the pipeline, right? And also people from all backgrounds who are coming to fight the pipeline. But by and large, the direct action component, militant wing of these movements is mostly working class people. It's mostly people who are not formally educated, and a lot of people coming from backgrounds that are not upper class, definitely not coastal elite. And it's a part of the US issue, which is like saying working class when what we really mean is white racial grievance, because obviously the working class is much, much larger than white people. So I think that that's important to note, to mention. And I do think that I think what you're describing in happening in London, I mean, it's also a problem of target, right? Like the target does not make sense to people. It's not evident to people why people are blocking that particular target.
Exactly.
Whereas here, I think that actually we do risk a lot of back and forth arguments with people who just want to go to their job. They just want to go to their work. Well, you can't go to work. We're stopping you from going to work because your work is delivering a drill piece to the pipeline. So you're not making it. You're not doing that today. And they can, I think that rhetoric about being against working people can be brought to bear, but I think it needs to be a harder sell. And I think that it should be a harder sell because people of all stripes and all class stripes are sacrificing a lot to fight against these pipelines. Yeah, and to fight back against climate change.
Yeah, but that's a really important point you're making, that obstructing someone's work isn't necessarily wrong, but there needs to be a clear connection between that work and the problem itself. Just indiscriminately targeting traffic, as XR and now Insulate Britain have done, it doesn't convey that message, because it can. A woman who's traveling to the hospital where she works as a nurse isn't a part of the problem. She might be dependent on a car to get to her hospital because of the way the whole system is set up, but she's not in charge of the system. She hasn't created it. She hasn't the power to refashion it. So yes, I'm not saying that we should never. I mean, that's a kind of workerist position that I'm totally opposed to. That we should sort of yield to anyone who is a worker and has a piece of equipment and never touch that. Absolutely not. But there needs to be. To repeat, there needs to be a clarity to your choice of target that's missing in this case, I think. Yeah.
That's true. Mandy, before I know we're over time, I want to say also that I felt like you did not. I was interested to read your section about the where you mention sort of brief instances of eco-sabotage, kind of as a way to show that it never amounted to much in the US. And I think those of us who are like working on the ground here would just, and I guess for this audience in particular, I feel like it's important to mention the Green Scare. That was really, really formative for activists of my generation. So I remember in your book where this section where it says, well, so there were these kind of like piecemeal acts of sabotage, but then it just sort of petered out. And I thought, wow, it just petered out. I mean, the first half of the 2000s for us were like grand juries, were people going to, people selling each other out, people being sold out by people that they thought they were in love with, people committing suicide, people being imprisoned for years and years and years after doing sabotage. And what I find to be dismaying is that people in negative reviews and critiques of your book use that as a reason why we shouldn't be talking about property destruction as a viable tactic. I think those are two separate discussions. Like, I do not think it's appropriate to say this is not a viable tactic because of state repression. But I do think it's important to call into the room all of these people who have really tried to use that tactic and faced intense repression because the U.S. worships at the altar of private property, such that people who are destroying SUVs here in the so-called U.S. are facing more prison time than murderers and rapists. Most of us who did basic down actions against Line 3 are facing felony theft charges. And it's all based on private property, ideals of private property, which is like the U.S.'s favorite thing. So I just think that that's one reason why I thought that your book makes a really great intervention for progressive liberal activists who are part of the mass climate movement and are peace policing people out of potent action. And they also believe that if they act nice, people will respect them. But that's not true. And I hope that people learn that on the ground fighting Line 3, because mass amounts of people came up from 350, from XR. A lot of liberal people came up, and they thought if they were just nice to the police, that things would be okay. But that was not true. And I think what people saw is that every little thing is called violence. Every little thing. Being angry is called violence. Moving a fence is called violence. Picking up a sandbag and putting it down is called violence. So if they're calling it violence anyway, right, we might as well normalize the actual efficacy and the logical context, where it makes sense to take these kinds of actions. But it seems to me that that's who your book is for, is to convince people like that. Because if your book was for other radicals, it would be engaging really specifically with, well, what do we do now after the Green Scare? What do we do in the wake of all of these things? What do we do to connect our militancy to also a mass movement that is open and accessible to a lot more people? So I think that there's a larger conversation to be had that might be, you're having to say things like Gandhi isn't the be all and end all. And, you're having to respond to Bill McKibben. The rest of us, radicals on the ground are like, yeah, Bill McKibben. Yeah, we already, we're with you.
Can I just say really quickly, Madeline, that's why it made a great subscription pick for a bookstore that has customers from all walks of life and who may not be familiar with like direct action at all. So to pair both of your books together, it made a lot of sense. But yes, I agree. Yeah. Andreas, I'll give you a chance to respond if you want.
No. I mean, I should perhaps have written on the Green Scare. My book is neither a history really of the Earth First and related movements, nor is it a book that speaks to those who are already committed to militancy. It is largely written in a critical dialogue with XR, because it came out of the conjuncture of 2019 when XR was really the big new thing in Europe, for good and bad. So, and obviously this book has limitations, including those that stem from the fact that I'm writing from a European perspective, and I don't know the North American context as well as I should. So I don't disagree with anything that you said.
It's okay. The North American perspective is, usually takes too much primacy on the world stage. So I'm interested to hear how things are happening in the mass movement world in Sweden and in Europe too. And like I said, I think that in that way, it's an important intervention. It's surprising to me that the liberals are the ones who are like, have you read this pipeline book? To me, that's pretty interesting. I'm hoping it might make a difference, just even in the dialogue we're able to have within our movements. With, people can get pretty damaging to each other on the ground with, with peace policing, frankly.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Bad jacketing, saying that people are infiltrators if they are talking, even using the phrase by any means necessary, Yeah, and so a book like yours might help those people move away from that, unless they just categorically reject it. Bill McKibben's probably mad at you.
Probably.
Well, I feel like I am cutting off the conversation just as it was getting good. I'm so sorry. As we're warming up, I hate that we're ending, but perhaps, when you both have new books out, I know, Andreas, you have several, we can do this again, maybe with Winona LaDuke, who is too busy this evening to join us, understandably. But I did have one more question that I had, and also came up in the chat, something near and dear to my heart, and also to people who are watching who are involved up in the Line 3 fight. The question from the chat is, so many of us feel so devastated by Line 3 being operational despite 8 years of resisting it. What do y'all have what do you recommend to keep hope alive and to keep fighting?
Well, this is for Madeline.
Well, it's for you too, Andreas.
It's
not just Line 3, but any of us in the climate movement who may have faced, what seems like big defeats. How do we keep hope alive?
Yeah, I mean, defeat really is, it's not a constant, but it's the normal state of affairs, I feel like. And I mean, my major experience as an activist before the climate movement was in the Palestine Solidarity movement, and it's the exact same thing there. It's very rare to experience victories. It happens sometimes on the climate front with a few local victories here and there. Well, I mean, I just have to say that my sense right now of where things are in the European climate movement is that, I don't know if this is a source of hope, but there are signs of people trying to experiment with and, groping for, searching for how to escalate the struggle and how to, how to step up. I don't know if you saw the hunger strike that happened in Berlin recently. A few young climate activists call themselves the last generation, and went pretty far with that hunger strike. There was a group calling themselves Fridays for Sabotage during the most recent Ende Gelände camp in the summer that ruptured a pipeline. This Insulate Britain thing, with all its flaws, is, I think, a symptom of the same sort of general feeling in much of the movement here, that we need to go further because we've only reached this far. We haven't really made a dent in the curves. We've stopped a project here and another one there, but overall business as usual is thriving still. And the big oil and gas and coal companies are continuously expanding. So, I mean, I don't really know how much of a real trend this is and where it might take us, but it sort of feels like the movement could be moving into a new phase with more radical tactics becoming a part of the repertoire. And we can't give up, obviously. That's an option because so much is at stake, everything that we love and care for. So we really need to before we give up, which I hope we'll never do, try out these other options and experiment as judiciously as possible with more militant tactics.
Madeline? I actually appreciated the last couple pages of your book, Andreas, where just you kind of throw out like this apocalyptic worst case scenario where there's like, anyway, but just that, where do we want to be? We want to be fighting this no matter what. Even if the only option available to us is to be in resistance during a time of apocalypse, that's where I want to be, and especially as someone raising children. It's really, I guess to me, having fought so hard to stop Line 3 and then having Line 3 now be operational, it's pretty devastating, and it's not because people didn't really try their best. People really, I mean, we can be self-critical, but people really put a lot on the line, and a lot of personal risk, a lot of physical risk. I think one thing that is helping me through that moment is that I'm in good company, and actually the people who are fighting that and going on to fight further also have been fighting other things, other campaigns, other infrastructure for years, and are descendants of people who have been fighting genocide for 500 years and are still in resistance. And I used to feel like nihilism was like something for annoying white teenage boys who don't want to do anything. But now I think maybe I am a nihilist. I've been learning more about a tradition that just has this beauty that like we're fighting unrelated to whether or not we're going to win. And I don't want to just totally move away from strategy. The more prosaic side of me thinks we don't know the ripple effects of what we do. We know what we had to do. We had to fight with everything we had to stop that pipeline. And we're going to fight with everything we have to continue to fight these infrastructure projects. And we don't know if line 3 will be stopped because a spill will happen and we'll say, see, I told you so. Or if something will happen and it'll be legislative. We don't know the ripple effects of what we do. And this has happened in a lot of other fights where the direct action part of it stalls something for a while, changes something in some way, and then something is stopped later. So that could happen, and I'm not saying that it won't. I hold optimism for that. But I mean, I think even beyond that, you know, for me, just as a person in the world, I'm moving into this larger sense of that this fight is worth it, and we fight no matter what, because we have to. So, yeah, and that we're in good company when we do it.
Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. I've been looking forward to this for such a long time, and I can't believe I was starstruck when both of you actually responded to me. So thank you so much for taking time to talk to like a small bookstore in Chicago. It really means a lot to us and the community here who have been fighting against Line 3. You can pick up How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Stay and Fight, and also Winona LaDuke's To Be a Water Protector, which was the other book in our subscription program. Pick them up at our bookstore, like I said, at the library, borrow them from your friends at camp. Just keep reading, keep fighting, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Maddie.
And thanks for all your work.
Thank you, Madeline.